right, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Dave Edwards and I'm the Chief Deputy Director here at OEHA. And thank you all for tuning in. This webinar is the fourth in a series of webinars that the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, or OEHA, is hosting as part of our effort to track and report on climate change and its impacts on California. At each webinar, speakers present a synthesis of the current scientific understanding on the featured topic and examples of actions underway to address the impacts. These examples are a small fraction of the work across California to develop and implement sustainable, equitable solutions to the challenges posed by climate change. The Indicators of Climate Change in California report demonstrates the importance of collaboration and partnerships in understanding and tackling the climate challenges that confront us. It is in that same spirit of collaboration and partnership that OEHA is convening these webinars with our state agency partners. Each webinar is an opportunity to strengthen partnerships among OEHA, our conveners, and the organizations represented by the speakers. Each webinar also presents opportunities to learn about areas of climate science or climate action that may be new for some of you joining us today. OEHA is grateful for these opportunities. We would like to thank our colleagues at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife for planning and convening today's webinar with us. The impacts of climate change on wildlife arise from changing conditions in the habitat in which they live. Over 1,000 species of vertebrates, birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and fish are found in this state, 65% of which are unique to California. In addition, the home is over to 30,000 species of insects and more than 6,500 types of plants. California hosts the greatest biodiversity of any state in the country, also the most imperiled due to climate change, habitat loss, and other stressors. The threats to biodiversity has made our state one of 36 global biodiversity hotspots. This is across the planet with exceptional concentrations of native species that are facing unprecedented challenges. This afternoon's speakers will talk about efforts across the state to track changes in and to manage or restore habitats and the wildlife species they support. The threat of extinction underscores the importance of conservation efforts such as the 30 by 30 initiative, which will be addressed by some of our speakers. I'll now turn it over to Carmen Milanes to walk through the rest of today's agenda. Carmen.
Thanks, Dave. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Carmen Milanes, and I manage the Climate Change Indicator Program at the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. I am joined today by members of that team, Tamara Cotter, Bennett Locke, Emma Tanner, and our latest addition, Annika Alexander Ozinskas. So before we begin, just some quick review of logistics. We will hold questions until after all the presentations. We have planned and set aside some time for Q&A and discussion following the 4 presentations. If you have questions for the speakers, you may enter them in the Q&A panel. You should see that at the bottom of your screen. We've requested the speakers to type in responses if they wish to the more straightforward questions. And also during the Q&A, you may also raise your hand to request to be unmuted. The chat is something that we're reserving for us to type in relevant hyperlinks related to the points being made by our speakers, as well as if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please go ahead and let us know through the chat. We're going to try and get to as many questions as we can, both from the Q&A box and from those of you who wish to be unmuted. As Dave has mentioned, we are pleased to co-host this afternoon's webinar with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and we're especially grateful to our first speaker, Whitney Albright, for helping us plan today's webinar. So, by way of a quick introduction before I turn it over to Whitney, Whitney Albright is a climate scientist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. She develops climate change related tools and resources that support the department's conservation and land management efforts. And she participates in various statewide climate change adaptation and mitigation initiatives. She received a BS in meteorology from the University of Oklahoma and an MS in forestry from the University of Washington. So, Whitney, it's yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Carmen, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here as well. Let me get this presentation started. All right. Are you seeing my screen okay?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks everyone for being here again. I'm going to really just dive right in. I'm hoping to cover a lot here in the next 15 minutes. I'm going to start with just a very brief introduction to the topic of biodiversity, as you'll hear me use that word a lot today. And then I'll spend the majority of time talking about a climate and biodiversity Sentinel site network and how the data from that network can be used to bridge science to management. So let's start with our really brief introduction here, and Dave set us up perfectly for this. But biodiversity is essentially the diversity of all living things. So that includes wildlife, plants, microorganisms, and so on. And California actually has more biodiversity than any other state, and including more endemic biodiversity. And that refers to those species that are only found here and in this area. If we focus in a little bit on wildlife specifically, California actually has one of the highest numbers of animal species in the US as well. As Dave mentioned, over 1,000 vertebrate species in the state, the majority of which are endemic. Not shown here, but we have thousands of different plant species as well. Many of those are endemic too. So together, this actually accounts for, I think, around 1/3 of all biodiversity in the country. California is very diverse. We also have a high percentage of those animal species that are at risk or that might be considered rare or threatened or endangered. We have one of the highest percentages of rare and at-risk animals in the country, second only to Hawaii. And so it's this combination of a high level of diversity paired with a high percentage, a high concentration of at-risk species that makes California a biodiversity hotspot. And it is one of 36 designated biodiversity hotspots on Earth. So pretty unique situation and unique challenges for us. There are a number of different threats to biodiversity, a number of different factors that are contributing to those risks that are causing a decline of biodiversity in California. Here are a few: habitat loss, invasive species, pollution, and in some cases, overexploitation of different natural resources. Climate change is, of course, a threat in and of itself, but it also exacerbates a lot of these existing threats, especially habitat loss, and as it contributes to the spread of invasive species in the state. So what do we do about that? How are we generally conserving biodiversity in the face of climate change? What I've listed here is just a very small sampling of some of the most general adaptation strategies. We can protect natural areas to try and prevent that habitat loss. We restore degraded ecosystems and habitats. We try to enhance connectivity across the landscape to make it easier for species to move, to find food, to find habitat as environmental conditions are changing. We try to protect areas that we think might serve as refugia in the future going forward. And more directly, we also practice invasive species removal or prevention wherever that might be possible. So why does this matter? Why is this important, this topic of biodiversity, threats to biodiversity, and what we're doing about it? I'm sure everyone has their own personal answer to that question, but I'll just say that biodiversity is really at the core of California's iconic landscapes, its cultural traditions, and even its modern economy and society. Biodiversity, as you know, also sustains us in a lot of ways. It provides us with drinkable water, breathable air, and food as well. And biodiversity is also important because in this context of climate change, it also buffers us from some of the impacts. So natural systems uptake and store carbon, to help mitigate climate change, as that's one of the greenhouse gases, or carbon dioxide is one of the greenhouse gases. We have wetlands that buffer communities from flooding or extreme floods and sea level rise along the coast. If you're in a city, you might have a nice tree canopy that's helping to reduce risks from extreme heat, which are also expected to increase over the coming years with climate change. So biodiversity, yes, is at risk, but it's also an important part of the climate adaptation solution. So just yet another reason to love California's biodiversity. And last thing here by way of an introduction, but the state does have a number of different conservation initiatives and investments to conserve biodiversity. I won't go into all of those today. I'm sure you're familiar with many of them, like the state's climate adaptation strategy and other types of large-scale planning efforts. But one I want to highlight is the 30 by 30 initiative. And this is part of really an international commitment. But this is California's version of 30 by 30, which is to protect 30% of California's lands and coastal waters by the year 2030. And the main objectives of that initiative are to protect and restore biodiversity directly, to expand access to nature for all, and to mitigate and build resilience to climate change. So I just wanted to call this out in particular as it relates to the project that I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit. Now I'm going to talk about the Climate-Biodiversity Sentinel Site Network. And to give you a little bit of background, this idea was generated by the California Biodiversity Network, or CBN, another network. This is a collaborative of different environmental experts in the state across different organizations. And the CBN was formed to support implementation of the 30 by 30 initiative. So this group had the idea, the vision of creating a lasting network of what we call living laboratories throughout California. And that is where we can monitor in the long term and in real time changes in biodiversity throughout the state and which of those changes are being driven by climate change. And then before I go any further, what exactly is a Sentinel site for the context of the talk today? That refers to an individual property where both long-term monitoring of both climate and biodiversity related variables is taking place via different data collection methods. And an individual property might have several different survey locations where we're doing monitoring. So what is the Sentinel Site Network? You may have guessed, it's a collection of different Sentinel sites. And this is a very collaborative endeavor. We're still kind of working with partners around how do we best formalize this and establish kind of a governing structure. So we are working with a lot of different organizations on the Sentinel Site Network, but what I'm going to be talking about today is more specifically DFW's piece, kind of our contribution to the larger network. Okay, so let's talk about that. Here is a map of DFW's Sentinel sites to date. North to south, east to west, we're covering a lot of different ecosystem types with these Sentinel sites, which is one of our goals. And each of these Sentinel sites is established on an ecological reserve or a wildlife area within the state. And these are areas where we are again monitoring for both climate and biodiversity using different types of equipment to help us evaluate exactly how is biodiversity changing and how is that related to climate change at the same site, at the same location. So a quick overview of the different components and actual things that are being monitored. From the climate side, we're utilizing weather stations to monitor climate change. From the biodiversity side, we have a number of different tools that we're using that I'm going to step through here in a moment. You'll notice some missing pieces, and we don't yet have a framework in place for monitoring vegetation as part of the network. There's a couple other things we're hoping to expand into, like more aquatic monitoring, pollinator monitoring. So just know this is kind of phase one with a lot of opportunity for growth. Okay. So climate monitoring is being achieved via weather stations that we're installing at each Sentinel site property. We're looking at the standard suite of meteorological variables. We're also looking at soil moisture and temperature to help us gauge drought, and then fuel moisture and temperature to help us evaluate wildfire risk at the different properties. So we're collecting all of this data essentially continuously across all these properties. So it does generate a lot of information. All of the information from our weather stations is being stored on the Dendra website. This was developed by UC Berkeley, and there are several other organizations that use this platform as well to host that weather station data. It's updated essentially live, and it is available to the public. So anyone is able to go in, view our weather station data, and also download it, work with it, create charts, graphs, etc. Okay, let's switch over to the biodiversity side. How are we monitoring wildlife at these different properties? We have set out some traditional camera traps that are used to photograph medium to large sized mammals. Here are a couple of those photos from some of our sites. We're also using this drift fence setup that you see in the upper left-hand photo. There's a little, what we like to call our photo booth at the end that has a small downward-facing camera that's used to photograph smaller mammals and also reptiles and amphibians at these properties. We're also deploying acoustic sensors. These help us to capture vocalizations of both birds and bats at these properties. Oh, and before I move on, and before I forget, this QR code you're seeing at the corner, that is a link to our monitoring protocols, and it has a lot more detail and exactly what we're doing, all the details of setup if you're interested in any of that information. And the last major piece of wildlife monitoring are these MODIS towers that are being added or installed either at or near every Sentinel site property. These are radio telemetry towers that are used to track any animal that comes within a certain radius of the tower that's been tagged with a little radio transmitter. So one of the neatest thing about these towers is that it doesn't matter who has tagged the animal, the tower itself will pick it up. So we've already been able to identify some species that have traveled, I think from Montana was one. We had a researcher who tagged a species in Montana and we picked it up at one of our stations. So these are going to be a really neat way to help us track larger scale wildlife movement and migration and potentially see how that might be changing with climate change. And this is a growing network. This is a map of MODIS towers in the US. There's a lot you can see in the east and the northeast, and we're really trying to build that out on the West Coast as well. Not only the department, but a lot of other organizations are coming together to do that. Okay, so where does all this data go? This does create a very high volume of data for us. The photos alone, we had over 2 million photos last year during our pilot season. The short answer is that we use a lot of different tools to process all of the data and to store it. And what I have here are just a few of the different tools or repositories where we're storing data. These are not necessarily DFW developed tools. They're existing tools that we use. So we have a lot of different partnerships in place to make that data storage and that data maintenance happen. What we're working on now is a way to try to centralize access to the data so that it's easier to share it. Our goal is to share this data publicly with other organizations, academic institutions, anyone who might be interested in utilizing it and analyzing it. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend too much on this. I touched on it a little bit earlier, but suffice it to say, we're hoping to expand the network. There's a lot more that we can do in this space. So we'll be working with partners and kind of continuing to grow this as much as we can here in the coming years. Okay, so now all of that information I talked about, how do we use it? What do we do with it? I think the worst thing would be to have it sit somewhere inaccessible where no one can see it and no one's doing anything with it, right? So that's what we do not want to happen. So we have essentially will be establishing in time these really long-term climate and biodiversity data sets. So we plan to share that data and to analyze it as kind of the first step. So we'll be able to use the data that we collect to perform status and trend analyses for different species, which is important for a lot of things we do at the department. We'll use it to evaluate species distributions and potential changes in movement or migration patterns, like I mentioned earlier. We can use it to help determine how quickly climate is changing at these different locations and what is the magnitude of that change. And then to go along with that, that can help us to evaluate what is kind of the relative climate-induced risk to ecosystems and species, not only at these individual properties, but maybe at other analogous properties, or even regionally, kind of let us do some comparison across different spatial scales. And then also to help us identify areas that might actually be acting as climate refugia, like I mentioned earlier, and what are those places that are turning out to be relatively buffered from climate change. Okay, so then what do we do with all of that information, those analyses, those types of results? Here are some kind of general ways that we use that information, but essentially to help us make decisions that are a little bit more risk-based, so having more of the information to make better decisions, and then to inform data-driven land management. You always hear talk about relying on the best available science, best available data. That's what we hope this will be. And then also to inform other statewide climate and biodiversity related efforts across our partners, of course, and across different organizations. So I'm going to end here. This is my last slide, but just a couple of examples of the different types of places where we see this data and these results fitting in. The first is the state's Wildlife Action Plan, and this is essentially kind of a conservation blueprint for the state that's developed by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. We also develop different management plans for species, as well as land management plans. So that's where some of these results really might be helpful at even a more local scale. But beyond that, I think there's going to be a lot of utility for informing these broader statewide climate adaptation efforts as well. As you know, the climate adaptation strategy for the state is updated at a regular interval. So our hope is that what we learn from the Sentinel site network can help us to continue refining what our adaptation goals are for the state, again, based on data and based on observation. And then last but certainly not least, we hope that the data from this network can form OEHA's climate change indicators report. I've been telling Carmen, please just wait for it. We're coming to you hopefully with something soon in the coming years where based on what we see, perhaps we'll be able to identify something that can serve as an indicator within that report, a way that wildlife or ecosystems are potentially being impacted by climate change. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. I'll say thank you so much again for being here, and I will turn it over to Carmen to go to the next speaker.
Thanks so much, Whitney. It's really exciting to think about all the data and observations that are coming down the road, and we look forward to utilizing that for many purposes, including incorporating them in the indicator report. Let's move on to our next speaker, Ben Saxon. We are honored to have a tribal member join us this afternoon. Ben is a field supervisor for the Karuk Tribe's Wildlife Division. He has worked for the tribe's Department of Natural Resources, particularly in the Watershed Program and Food Security Program for about 18 years now. Ben is also a Yurok and Karuk native. And his knowledge of the natural world, especially in Yurok and Karuk ancestral territory, make him an excellent Native American naturalist. Ben holds a bachelor's degree in art education and art studio from Cal Poly Humboldt. His favorite medium of creativity is pottery, being quite proficient on the potter's wheel. Ben, microphone's yours.
Hello, I need to share my screen, right? Is that it? Can everybody see?
Looks great,
my screen?
Ben. Yes,
okay.
Thanks.
And oops, about that. I was trying to bring up my notes on the other screen. Sorry. Okay, now you get started.
No problem. You're good. Thanks.
Okay, so Ayuki, that means hello in Karuk. the changing climate and how it has affected wildlife in our Karuk ancestral ecosystems. The Karuk Tribe, indigenous to what is now Northern California, has a deep connection to the land and its ecosystems. Climate change possesses significant threats to our traditional territory, impacting wildlife and natural resources crucial for our cultural practices and livelihood. Monitoring these changes is vital for the Karuk Tribe to adapt and mitigate for these adverse effects. Now, direct impacts of climate change on the Karuk territory's ecosystem is the catastrophic fire and extreme extended years of drought are the two main impacts on the environment due to our changing climate. Our untreated plantations of conifers due to the U.S. Forest Service mismanagement, with thousands of acres of trees planted a few feet apart and left alone for decades, in some cases a century. This is photo. The first photo is showing completely untreated area, and then the next photo shows the shrubberies and a clearing going on with, but look, it's still, this is a plantation in the background, and it's still super thick. That makes for just like a matchbook of extreme fire just tears through this, making a massive tinderbox and unstoppable firestorms. Like everybody knows about these whoosh things that happen, especially here in California. And we've had 20 to 50 years of drought with low precipitation winters and unpredictable summers, which are current climate changes in just the last 60 years. And like I said, the consequences are just unstoppable firestorms, and it equals destruction and death to whole ecosystems full of the most diverse and numerous species of plants and wildlife on Earth. You know, like we were talking about earlier. So with the herbaceous layer struggles to survive in these dense plantations, and these animals need both. Our animals need retention zones and openings for their habitat that the plantations just don't survive. It's like stoppage. This is an example of the McCash fire that happened up here. This is before that fire happened. This is Tin Bear Mountain. And this is the devastation it left over that mountain. And right here next to our camera too, the fire came right through there and melted our camera. The consequences I'd already touched on. This shows even more devastation up in a little bit higher country. This is an even more recent fire from last year's fires that we had all around Orleans and up in our area, Siskiyou County and Humboldt County, northern Humboldt County. So moving on to how what how Karuks view the world, and we're already thinking about climate change and have come up with we've even come up with a climate adaptation plan. It's the Karuk people are fix the world people. We have world renewal ceremonies every lunar calendar to do just that. Heal the world physically and spiritually. Before other humans contacted the Karuk people, it is known that we took care of everything surrounding us, and everything surrounding us, and our ancestors also took care of us. Now, the Karuks have we've been leaders in starting collaboration in our area here close to where I live, and and this is within, these are private these are you can tell on the map too where we're at located here in California. Many non-government and government entities came together back in 2014 to create the WKRP project area, and you can see there it's WKRP stands for not the radio, not the old TV show based on that radio show or whatever. Remember that WKRP in Cincinnati. Anyways, it's the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership. And when we started our wildlife program in 2018, we integrated into this project area with our wildlife cameras, and we put 15 cameras in each of those 4 project areas to make we had 60 game cameras out there to check for mainly for elk, for our elk project, to study population and what have you. And so so you can see over here some of the things that we did as far as putting fire on the land too, and then there's the elk coming through. And so to continue to talking about our elk, I'm going to talk about 3 specific indicator species, even though we as Karuk people, we're not a single species. We don't focus on single species. We focus on the whole world, and all species are equally important, really, but there are certain species that are super important to us. Ishuk is the Karuk way to say elk. Ishuk. The Karuk Wildlife Division was formed under the Department of Natural Resources in 2018 with a grant to study the Marble Mountain Roosevelt elk population in their wintering range along the Klamath River corridor. I already talked about the game cameras, so we also we set out transects and sampled elk scat to get their DNA so that we could get more of a centralized population estimates along with our game cameras. And also we used we got to collar some elk. We partnered with CDFW in 2019. They helped us with immobilization of a couple, but we also used clover traps that we learned from the Karuk Tribe up in Washington. I don't have a picture of them, but it's a collapsible trap, and we don't have to use any drugs. And there you can see here one of our collars on the the elk that swam right across the river as soon as we collared it. It was a male. Its name was Wathiwan, which means swimmer in Karuk. And then that collar right there, that was the same collar that was on him, and we had to go find it. It was 2 years later it dropped off that it was programmed for that. And so these collars have send GPS signals either every hour or every 2 hours, and then if it's every 1 hour, they will last 2 years on the elk, and if it's every, did I say hour? Every 2 hours, it'll last 4 years. Anyways, I think it's 1 and 2 years. And you got to move on. Sorry about that. So, and part of what we're doing actively too is meadow restorations, and to create more grassland area, and also for the grazing and foraging of our issue and poofitch. Poofitch is the word for our deer. So we're with the helping the ungulates, and then many other species of animals and everything will really dig the meadowlands that we're trying to help expand, and we also would like to eventually, because our landscape had a lot more meadows on it than previously in those older, in a long time ago. We want to actually create meadows where there's lots of white oaks and black oaks and madrone, more deciduous areas, and kind of flat areas to help with all the wildlife that need that area. And also it would help to keep, because most of the open areas are private lands or private properties, and it would help alleviate some of the elk going through people's gardens and things like that, and they would be able to graze and hang out away from other private properties, not to keep anyways. So because that thing is up in the way, I can't read my top part, but this Takanukawar is the word for fisher. That's the next animal I wanted to focus on, but I can't really see my word up there. Anyways, that word that you see up there is the Karuk word for fisher. And so at this particular game camera, you can see the potential prey and food for the fisher. I believe the fisher is on at least on the not the you have your endangered species, then you have like a selected, you all probably know what I mean, but anyways, this camera shows 3 ringtails, which is the most ringtails we ever caught on one camera frame, and also 3 squirrels right there. So I thought that was pretty funny, because it's the same camera that shows this particular fisher here. And then you see the raccoon, of course. Pacific fishers are an important indicator species to Karuk wildlife that indicate a healthy, homogeneous woodlands that are deciduous dominant with mostly oak and madrone trees. And with those trees being more dominant, the resulting micro ecosystem is open meadows with intermediate spring-fed kind of grass dominant zones, perfect for wildlife, watering and calving areas for our elk. And also the fisher's habitat are usually hollowed out black oak trees, and the those type of trees are conducive and of where meadows should be, and also where where the fishers like to feed and all those other animals. We also studied beavers, and it's the Sapinich is the Karuk word for beaver, and Sapinich means the old wise one of the river. Beavers indicate healthy zones in the river and its tributaries that support safe rearing areas that the salmonids can grow, and water flows will slow creating swampy areas for a multitude of plant and wildlife communities to thrive. And the salmon that are from around here were one of our most important our important food in our diet as Karuk people and Yurok people. A lot of people along the Klamath River, and that the word for salmon is ama.
Excuse me, Ben. We're at time. I'm wondering if you could just maybe wrap it up.
Well, yeah, these are quick. I'll just wrap it right up.
Okay, thank you.
Here you go. Here's the local beavers family spotted being busy as beavers, eh? And then this is kind of like a thing I made up for, like a collage of kind of a collaborate. Let's collaborate. Let's quit squabbling. There's the two bears squabbling, and then here's the love of the bears to that tree, just snuggling up, and then these two elk just snuggling it up. So yeah, we all of us need to come together and fix the world, and then we'll be creating a better pathway for a healthier future to let our younger generations become positive stewards of our land. That's all people. A cute little picture on the pathway. All right, I'm done.
Thank you so much, Ben. It's interesting to see some of the tools that Whitney had talked about, but I also want to recognize the fact that our tribal nations, we need to recognize the value of traditional or indigenous knowledge that has been accumulated over long histories of tribes' interactions with the planet and their environments, and in the spirit of collaboration, taking that along with the more contemporary tools of modern science, it would really be a good way of leveraging information to together help tackle our problems. So thanks, Ben. Let's move to our next speaker, Monique Fountain. Monique is the director of the Tidal Wetland Program at the Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve. I'm tripping over my words here. CDFW facility located along the edge of beautiful Monterey Bay. The Tidal Wetland Program embraces a collaborative approach to estuary-wide strategic planning that brings science to management using an ecosystem-based management approach, regularly engaging over 100 stakeholders since 2004. Monique?
Great, thank you so much. Now I'm going to take us into the mud. We'll do a deep dive into the mud. We'll look at some of the actual on-the-ground restoration that we're doing here in Elkhorn Slough. So where is Elkhorn Slough? Elkhorn Slough is about 50 miles south of San Francisco Bay, in the middle of Monterey Bay. It's a 7-mile long coastal embayment emptying into a branch of the Monterey Bay Canyon. And so I'm with the Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve, and I'll refer to it as ESNR or the NER. And there's 30 NERs throughout the country. Each reserve represents a partnership between NOAA and a state agency. And in that state, so a state agency in each state. And at Elkhorn Slough, this is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. It owns and manages the reserve. The third partner at the Elkhorn Slough Reserve is the Elkhorn Slough Foundation. The foundation is a certified land trust conserving over 4,000 acres around the reserve and serving as a fiscal agent for the NER funding that comes in from NOAA. So as part of the NER, we focus on place-based science with long-term monitoring used to inform management. And so we're both a state and federal Sentinel site. Like other coastal estuaries, let's see, I think that was a video, not be playing, but might not play. All right. So like other coastal estuaries, the slough is a rich ecosystem with a diverse array of species and complex food webs. Portions of the Elkhorn Slough are designated as a Ramsar site, marine protected area, state ecological reserve, and wildlife management. So the slough is also an important stop on the Pacific Flyway for migratory birds. This unique environment draws people to the slough, creating an economic engine driven by ecotourism. The bottom line, Elkhorn Slough is a high-value system, both ecologically and economically. Oh, here's my video. There we go. All right, Elkhorn Slough is very set in a working landscape with extensive historical modifications. Highway 1 runs right through the slough here, and you can see a lot of remnant dikes that run through this area too. Here's some remnant dikes along in here. And this nominal high tide that you see here, you can see how vulnerable these marshes are to sea level rise. If we and so this is kind of looking through. Here's another little area here was diked and drained, and then a lot of the dikes in Elkhorn Slough have broken down over time, and so the tides have returned to these areas. So we look back in time, we can see how some of the historical land use practices have really changed this landscape. So this is a reconstruction from 1870. And it shows the extent of our tidal wetlands at that time. So blue is water, brown is mud, and green is marsh. So looking forward to by 2000 here, Elkhorn had lost about 50% of its tidal marsh. This is largely due to diking and draining of wetlands. So what are we restoring? So even though I'm showing you a map from the 1870s, we're not trying to restore the estuary to any particular point in time. What we're restoring is this really rare habitat, and the goal is to bump the system back into being self-sustaining. So we're restoring ecosystem processes, such as the ability for the marsh to track sea level rise. Here at the Elkhorn Slough NER, we have the Tidal Wetland Program. It's a broad group of agency representatives, scientists, and community stakeholders that drive the trajectory of restoration through a collaborative process that we started back in 2004. And over the last 20 years, we've produced a large number of guiding documents and implemented several restoration projects. So here's the current distribution of various habitats. So again, the blue is water, brown is mud, and green is marsh. And the areas that are shaded in white are tidally restricted areas, and the crosshatch areas are areas that were formerly diked, and they're now open to full tidal influence. The estuary has a legacy of diking in a system with low sediment supply and subsidence. So even after tidal exchange was returned to these formerly diked areas and subsided areas, they remained too low. They didn't come back up. And so they remained too low really to support marsh. You can see there's just a little bit bathtub ring around the outside here. And they're not really getting built up over time by sediment since the river was diverted from the estuary. And so these marshes themselves are actually subsiding. We've lost a lot in the past, and unfortunately for the marshes that remain, things are not looking so good for the future. Many of our remaining marshes that weren't diked are not really tracking sea level rise. They're gradually sinking, and modeling suggests that it won't take much of an acceleration of sea level rise to drown them. So this is a table from the Ocean Protection Council's latest predictions, and this shows the expected tide levels based incremental tide height with based on various models. So here is a 50 centimeter that could happen anywhere from say 2050 to 2150 based on various models. So I'm showing 50 centimeter, 100 centimeter, and 200 centimeter tidal sea level rise, and I'll show you what the habitat changes will look like. So the focus really are what we can look at is what can happen with different elevation changes, but we can't really predict when because of all the variables that go into the modeling here. So here is so with sea level rise, we'll see these various habitats shift, assuming that no additional action is taken. So this shows a 50 centimeter sea level rise, and it already tops these diked areas that I showed you before. This is 100 centimeters, and this is 200 centimeters here. So even at this point, though, when most of the marshes have migrated out of Elkhorn Slough due to our steep slopes that you can kind of see here, it'll still be ecologically a really high value system. The eelgrass beds will likely expand, and of course our charismatic megafauna will have more room and likely increased food source from expanded mudflats. So this planning process of looking not just at the king tide shift, but at specific habitat shifts has allowed us to do some really critical planning. So we've looked at a number of different areas for things that we can do. So using a broad set of criteria, we identified potential priority marsh migration areas. And if there are willing sellers and funding that's available, these lands can be acquired and conserved for marsh migration in this area. We've also identified priority areas for thin layer sediment addition and priority areas for thicker soil addition that we can do. So in the near term, we are currently raising and restoring a little video here. And looking at how this marsh will survive into the future. So this is a video of a restoration project currently underway. This was phase one of a roughly 130 acre project that's along the south end of Elkhorn Slough. When it's complete, a total of about 450,000 cubic yards of soil will be added to a previously diked and degraded marsh. So ESNR scientists were able to reconstruct the historic channel network, and using GPS mounted on these tractors, the construction crew was able to recreate this historic channel configuration, which was really pretty cool. So the project also includes restoring 130 acres of salt marsh ecosystem, protecting and improving water quality, reducing tidal scour in the slough, increasing our understanding of blue carbon, which is the carbon in coastal ecosystems, improving southern sea otter habitat, and then improving resilience to climate change. So how do we integrate climate change adaptation into our project? So let's start by looking at elevation, because that really is the key here. So this is a digital elevation model, also called a DEM. It's from a drone or a UAV. And again, we're using blue for water, brown for mud, and green for marsh. Shows these areas here. Now this rust red color along the edge here is really high elevation marsh. And so after the project, you can see that we raised this whole area up to really high elevation marsh. And we also, oops, let's see, I'm going backwards here. I wanted to show you this too. A lot of the material that we got some of it from a river flood control project north of us, but we also got a lot of it from this hillside here. And you can see that we've created this area here for marsh migration into the future. So that kind of gives you a sense of this is what we carved out to raise the marsh in this area. And so again, what does restoration mean? Bumping this system back into balance, bringing this marsh up to an elevation where the plants can actually trap sediment and as the sea level rises and track sea level rise. So in addition to relying on wild recruitment of marsh plants, we planted over 20,000 greenhouse plants that were part of experiments looking at things like facilitation and competition and soil amendments and initial plant size and various watering regimes. And we also opportunistically tracked different construction variances like different fill material and compaction and moving plant material around. And so as part of the NER, we already have a really extensive monitoring program. And this sets all of this information gathered specifically for this project into a much larger context. So here in particular, we have 23 different parameters that we're monitoring and measuring, both for the implementation, did we build the marsh we intended to build, and ecological effectiveness. Is it functioning the way we intend it to function? So we've been pioneering the use of UAVs in this type of work for much of this monitoring, but we're also using more classical ecological tools such as the surface elevation tables and permanent transects that we have. What's that we look at? There's a permanent transect that through, and we look at things from percent cover to some of the below ground processes that are developing as well. And a lot of community involvement in monitoring our restoration area as well. I'm just going to talk really quickly about a few of our lessons learned. So again, getting back to this is a digital elevation model. And so as I mentioned, in the last few years, we've been relying really heavily on the UAV data. So this is an overview of a portion of the restoration, and it provides detailed marsh elevation. So each one of these color bins represents 4 millimeters of elevation change. And this really allows us to see the microtopography really well, and we can see where change is taking place in pretty great detail. What we learned from this then was that a marsh plain elevation can be achieved on soft soils. The soil was placed with low ground pressure equipment, but that equipment's still really heavy. And some of the tractors weighed up to 200,000 pounds fully loaded. So understanding the compactions and consolidation rates from phase 1 allowed us to build the future phases actually even higher, because we understood a lot more how this was working. Carbon sequestration is, again, that the carbon that's sequestered in these blue carbon sequestered in coastal ecosystems. Let's see, I have to move forward here. Carbon sequestration. Yes. So a significant portion of the project was funded through the California Greenhouse Gas Reduction Program. And we invested a lot in understanding these blue carbon functions. We sampled a lot of different metrics. Above ground, we collected plant biomass, monitored accretion rates, and below ground quantified carbon cores. And so we really did a lot of monitoring gas flux. And what we learned was really, I think, something important that we hadn't necessarily, it wasn't obvious in the beginning. So we have a lot more vegetation, thus blue carbon function, in the very lowest parts of this restoration site. So in these tidal channels. And in the short term, they win, but this vegetation will be flooded out and lost in the long run as sea level rises. So quantifying this difference allowed us to see and internalize our conviction that yes, it will take longer for this marsh to develop, but we're building it for the future when most of our other marshes in the system will likely be struggling. And so there's a real trade-off. Our lesson learned was this trade-off between the blue carbon function now versus future climate resilient, having a future climate resilient marsh. And so looking at marsh recruitment, so pickleweed is the most common marsh plant in our region. We don't have Spartina here. And since pickleweed seeds are widely distributed with the tides, we decided not to plant the majority of our restoration area. And then kind of looking back to what we saw before, it's a slow process at this higher elevation. It's a much harsher environment. So I wanted to point out a couple of little things about adapting, how we were adapting this restoration specific to climate change. We have we've used some agricultural scale sprinklers that we actually put out in the marsh to understand the drought impacts over the last few years, and that was an interesting project. We are sloping our haul out areas for seals to be able to access this area at all different tides, and of course, as sea level rises. And then we're really providing a high tide refugia for shorebirds that use this area. And we have a lot, and we've seen in our restoration, you can really see it in here. Hard to get a good picture of them, but we have really a lot, and you can see it here too, lots of birds that are in our utilizing the restoration area at high tide. So we have a big team that works on this. This is our ESMER team, other collaborators from other universities. of funding to get this done. Coastal Conservancy, Department of Water Resources, California Wildlife Conservation Board, Department of Fish and Wildlife, Ocean Protection Council, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So a big partnership went into this, other project partners, and yep. And so we'll take questions at the end. So thank you very much, Carmen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Monique. I love that term, bumping the system back. Hopefully we can explore that a little more later. So let's move on to our final speaker, Dena Spatz, who will talk about the role of community science in all this. So by way of introduction, Dena is the biodiversity coordinator with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, working alongside agency, nonprofit, tribes, and academics to bring together and distribute information to help conserve the state's biodiversity. Dena serves as a liaison with the California Biodiversity Network, California 30 by 30 team, and the California Biodiversity Council, working closely also with the Science Institute to establish long-term biodiversity monitoring through what we heard from Whitney on, the Sentinel site network. And Dena organizes the state's annual Biodiversity Day, which includes scaling community science participation. She received her PhD at UC Santa Cruz in the Conservation Action Lab within the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department. With that, Dena?
All right, thanks for having me here. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for having me. My name is Dena Spatz. As you said, I'm the biodiversity coordinator at CDFW. Thanks to Ben and Monique for the awesome zoom into wildlife issues. I'm going to be zooming back out at state level just to talk about how community science is really a foundational action for scaling biodiversity conservation. All right, so as previously described, biodiversity of California is incredibly unique. It is important as a foundation to ecosystems and to people, and is itself one of the solutions to adapting and mitigating climate impacts. And as Whitney showed this slide earlier, climate change is obviously a major threat to wildlife and to biodiversity generally, but it's the compounding effects of climate on top of these other drivers like habitat loss and invasive species that's really driving the biggest problem of the biodiversity crisis. But the great news, as you've heard already in the other talks, is that direct conservation action really can reverse species losses, restore populations and ecosystems, improve local biodiversity and climate benefits. And a recent study that just came out definitively showed that conservation actions like invasive species control and eradication, habitat restoration, protected area establishment, sustainable management, all these things improved the state of biodiversity, or at least slowed decline in 2/3 of all the cases that were studied globally. So conservation really can work. And thanks to a lot of state-led biodiversity initiatives, Whitney mentioned CNRA's California 30 by 30, nature-based solutions. There's also the Cutting Green Tape program and other agency-driven funding that's coming out that's really helping to direct conservation actions, and environmental stewardship has really scaled up across the state recently. And this work is really being done by a diversity of communities, especially by tribes. And so what I really want to point out here is that all of these activities will involve people, not just environmental career professionals like myself, but the community at large. And given the scale of threats to biodiversity and still limited resources, relatively speaking, to address a biodiversity crisis, it is really critical to consider how to leverage public participation in conservation action. And a major way to do this is through an activity called community science. So community science provides really unique experiential learning opportunities while harnessing the data needed to really make important conservation decisions. So just some quick definitions of what this is before moving on. Community science is the public participation in research and monitoring that improves social learning, collective action, and empowerment, while also producing knowledge about biodiversity and natural resource management. Until recently, community and citizen science have been defined separately, where citizen science was researcher-led and community science was community-led. But today, the term citizen science is slowly being discarded for a more inclusive title that combines the two objectives into one, and I'll be using that community science term today. So also, community science activities have really become important to many agency-led efforts, including California 30 by 30. The more we can know about biodiversity, the better we can do to act to protect it. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to walk through some examples of how researchers have included the community in scaling up scientific activities and how that really connects to conservation, as well as positive community environmental education. And I also just wanted to note that there are tons of examples out there. So today I'm just going to be sharing a few that CDFW is involved with or is supporting. So the Department of Fish and Wildlife conducts countless activities with the public to collect data on its wildlife to inform management actions. Some are listed on the screen, from bighorn sheep and raptor surveys to bobcat population surveys with camera data, talking to anglers to assess fisheries, doing wildlife health reporting, and many, many more. CDFW also works in partnership with lots of groups to do this kind of work. So I'm going to step through some of those examples. Okay, so starting with salmon, and just a little bit of backstory here. So in 2020, young Chinook salmon in the Central Valley hatcheries started taking on a spinning behavior and often were dying. It was determined that they had a lethally low amount of thiamine, which is the B1 vitamin. So this was likely due to a recent diet shift by ocean-going adults to a predominantly anchovy diet, which coincided with the mass increase across California current of anchovies. These anchovies were actually following marine heat waves that had been occurring since about 2014. And it turns out that anchovies produce an enzyme called thymidase that breaks down thiamine. And subsequently, young salmon were ending up with this lowered thiamine levels. So there was a huge need to understand egg and juvenile survival in order to inform what concentrations of thiamine was needed for juvenile Chinook salmon to survive. And at the same time, UC Davis's Center for Community and Citizen Science brilliantly tapped into local schools and CDFW's Classroom Aquarium program and developed lessons and resources where students could be the community scientists that were implementing the research in the classroom to answer these important questions. So students and teachers are trained to monitor and report young salmon growth and survival and ultimately release the healthy ones back into the rivers. And by participating in these projects, students get hands-on conservation science experience and direct interaction with academics and scientists. The teachers receive professional development support. Importantly, the researchers get the data needed to understand how to increase salmon survival. And in the last year, over 1,800 high school students from 5 counties in California participated in this effort, and this is expected to grow. So it's been a really exciting program. So now on to bees as an example. The California Bumblebee Atlas is a collaborative community science project that was developed to track and understand native bumblebee populations. This was a response to the large declines we were seeing in native bees everywhere. And specifically in California, there are 8 bumblebee species that are threatened, mostly from a combination of threats from habitat loss, climate change, diseases, likely pesticides. So the Bumblebee Atlas allows for the community to track population trends, which subsequently is helping CDFW and partners to prioritize areas to target conservation of declining species. So this has been going on since 2022. And since that time, volunteers have collected information on over 10,000 bumblebees and the plants that they've been foraging on. So it's a super exciting project with a lot of data. The survey period for 2024 is currently active, so consider getting involved. It's a really fun way to learn about the bumblebees around you while giving back to a really impactful research project. There are some specific steps you need to take to get involved, including a brief online training. So please check out the website to get signed up. And if you are already trained, just a heads up, there's a US-wide Bumblebee Blitz happening this weekend. So it's a really good time to get a grid and conduct a survey. So in addition to the Bumblebee Atlas, there are many data repositories for collating researcher and community collected wildlife and biodiversity data. And these platforms are being accessed by researchers and conservation decision makers. So I just wanted to zoom into one app in particular that is really harnessing the power of community scientists from anywhere at any time. And this example is iNaturalist. This is a nature mapping and tracking app which originally came out of the California Academy of Sciences. What's amazing about this application is all you need is a phone and a sense of inquiry. You see something in nature and wonder what it is. As a researcher, you can use it. You can set up a collection project to capture focal species at a certain place in time, or set up other specific project parameters. There's a lot you can do with the platform. And for California alone, there are over 35,000 species that have been observed on iNaturalist by over 300,000 people, and that number is growing. So just quickly about how this works. So it's a free app. You can download it to your phone and sign up. Then you just get outside and photograph wild plants or animals that you see. You upload them to the platform. The date, time, and locations are auto-generated. So then all you have to do is you can run the observation through an AI feature, help tell you what it is that you're seeing. And then the important piece is to submit that observation so that it can be verified by the community, which is made up of thousands of hobbyists and scientists around the world. So once that observation is verified, it becomes research grade, and then it can actually be used for research after that. So give it a try if you haven't yet. I'm going to go through and provide some examples of what's been found using this tool and how it's being used. So first, species discoveries. So here's a fun story. There's a woman in California who was picking blueberries on her property when she saw this insect on a manzanita bush. She posted the observation, and soon multiple scientists together confirmed that it was the rediscovery of the western red cicada, which was thought to be extinct. So this is helping to drive new surveys and search for this species. Also in California, someone found an ocellated bronze skink that likely hitchhiked from the Mediterranean via the nursery trade. Today, this observation is helping trace introduction pathways of non-native species in order to plan and prevent the future introduction of damaging pests. So this platform can be really important for tracking invasive species as well as native species. Also, iNaturalist has allowed us to observe species movements at a scale never seen before, and alongside changes in species movements under climate change. So these reports, these three examples that I have are actually reports from this last spring. The first image shows native jellies moving into the coast earlier than normal. The other two examples track non-native species movements that are starting to occur. So this is really thanks to the community at large for posting observations to the platform of the things that they're just observing as they're going about their day or going out and doing a bioblitz. And on the flip side, it's also thanks to researchers who are mining the platform for the data and analyzing it to detect these trends. So I did a quick Google Scholar search before giving this talk and saw that there were almost 6,000 research articles citing iNaturalist use in California. And so this use of the tool has really been prolific for the sciences. So finally, before I finish, I just want to introduce you to 3 really fun ways to get started with iNaturalist projects and where you can participate in self-led or group-led bioblitzes. I've used that word before, but bioblitzes are basically biodiversity snapshots when you go out and you survey an area during a certain time period. So I'm going to give 3 examples of this, and you can find all the information on the website at the bottom of the screen. So first is Snapshot Calc Host. This is an event happening right now. It ends at the end of June. And the goal is to document as many species as possible along the coast and rocky intertidal, particularly those whose ranges are affected by climate change and changing oceanic conditions. So check out the website at the bottom, navigate to Snapshot Calc Host to learn more, which also has really important information about how this information is being used. So all you have to do is, if you are anywhere near the coast, snap a photo, upload it to iNaturalist, and it'll count towards this large snapshot of the California coastline. So another example is California Biodiversity Day. This is a statewide celebration of the state's biodiversity that was created actually by Jerry Brown's executive order on September 7th, 2018, and that launched the state's first biodiversity initiative. Since that time, the event has grown to have over 100 statewide events occurring throughout the week. We are in the planning stages right now, so please consider hosting an event such as a BioBlitz, or really any event that connects people to the nature around them. You can also participate in one. So you can visit the bit.ly site on the screen or snap a picture of the QR code. This takes you to a survey form where you can sign up to host an event or let us know that you're hosting an event. and a website will be coming out soon with more information. One of the cornerstones of this effort is a challenge to find at least 30 species and upload it to iNaturalist. So this is a really fun way to learn how to participate in September biodiversity snapshot events, especially because it's really just the start of the migration period. And this effort also links back to the 30 by 30 initiative as well. So for this challenge, you do have to join the challenge. So I have the bit.ly link up on the screen. So if you navigate to that link and you click join, then anywhere you are in California between September 7th and 15th, if you add an observation to INAT, it'll count towards your 30 species challenge. And the goal is we'd love to get up above 3,000 species observation across the state during that time period. Also, if you're a birder, feel free to go birding for California Biodiversity Day. You would need to take pictures or sounds of birds and upload it to iNaturalist account. But we also have a California Biodiversity Day profile. So if you're an eBirder, you can go birding, submit your checklists, but share them with California Biodiversity Day. And when you do that, your bird report will go into a larger trip report so you can see what birds have been observed during those dates as well. Finally, there is the City Nature Challenge. So this is the flagship nature challenge. It takes place in April of each year. This really grew from a friendly competition between Cal Academy in San Francisco and the Los Angeles Natural History Museum back in 2016. And then it has grown to an international competition with hundreds of cities and over 60,000 participants in 2024. So to participate in this, individuals sign up their cities or regions, and then anyone in those areas can participate just by taking a picture if they're within a boundary. So there, again, you can navigate to the website to learn more. And for all of these activities and just the use of iNaturalist generally, the data goes into the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF. And in the coming years, California data will also be made available on CDFW databases for the public and researchers to access and use. So in summary, California's biodiversity is incredible, it's unique, and it's also endangered. But conservation actions work, we know they do, and communities everywhere can really play a major role in scaling up success and what we know about the state of biodiversity. So if you're a researcher looking for creative ways to scale up your monitoring or research capacity, community science may be the right avenue for you. If you've just got a sense of wonder, iNaturalist is a great platform to mess around with. It's a really easy tool. It's great for just simply engaging people with nature, getting nature questions answered quickly and accurately, while also submitting data to science. So with that, I just want to say thank you for having me here today. And yeah, that's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Dena. That was I almost find that motivational. It's like, it makes me want to go and engage in these various activities. And I hope a lot of the folks in our audience have been inspired to help contribute information to iNaturalist or participate in those other activities you've highlighted. So we have a bit of time for discussion and questions and answers. I would like to ask the speakers to turn their cameras on for this final few minutes. And I'm going to start with questions that we have on the chat. And those of you in our audience, if you do want to ask a question verbally, just raise your hand and we will unmute you and call you in turn. So I'm going to start with a question for Monique. It's a two-part question. Will the restored area comprise all the future sediment supply to the marsh, or is there a larger watershed supply? And then the part two question is, do you project that sediment supply will suffice into the future?
All right, so that's an interesting question. So when I mentioned that we are a sediment-starved estuary, it's because the local rivers have been diverted. Typically on the hillsides around the marsh, that sediment's staying there. It's got vegetation growing on it and it's holding it in. So if you have a big rain event or something like that, you could dislodge some of it. But all of that material, at least most of that material that we took off the hillside, moved into the marsh, that would have stayed there for quite a long time because it had invasive grasses on it that was holding it in. So We don't have a lot of sediment. We don't have a great sediment supply for the future. And I think that's an area of concern. One of the things that really competes with marsh for sediment are these subsided marshes because they serve as accommodation spaces. So the sediment floating around is going to get trapped in those potentially instead of the marsh. So they compete with the marshes for sediment. So it's a complicated question. I hope that wasn't too complicated of an answer, but I think we are seeing more. So we are able to measure some marine sediment influence coming in, and I think that we'll have to see. We'll have to continue to study it and see what the sediment supply does. Thanks. We can't hear you, Carmen.
Oh, sorry, Ben, you have your hand up. Thanks, Monique.
Yeah, I had a question for Monique too. And I
Sure.
was wondering if there are any active beavers in that area where you're talking about, and how because they could also help in helping with creating and the marsh areas too and stuff. I was just wondering if you had any active beavers in the area.
We do not. Not that I'm aware of.
How do I unraise my hands? Okay,
There's a lot of cute, charismatic creatures among the images you shared, Monique. I guess not beavers. Okay, there was. I'm not sure. I apologize if it's in the chat for everyone to see, but Whitney, there was a request for the link to the Sentinel site network. Is everybody seeing that, Bennett?
Yeah, I dropped in a link to a website on, again, just CDFW's portion of the network because we have our CDFW map there. I think I also dropped in a direct link to the map. And as I was sharing that, I realized it was missing a property. So we will get that updated soon. So the website will host the most current version of the map.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question for Dena. Many community science programs for students seem to focus on the high school level. Do you have any recommendations for sources getting younger students involved? And I guess it's a joint question for Whitney as well. Any opportunities for student involvement in the Sentinel sites? This question is coming from a middle school teacher, science teacher in the San Joaquin Valley. Dena, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So the City Nature Challenge website, I did not provide that, but I will when I'm done. When I'm done talking, it has a ton of amazing educational resources for students of all ages, from really young ones to middle schoolers and high schoolers. So I recommend taking a look at that. And it's really teaching, inquiry-based learning and just how to make observations in nature. I think you have to be at least 13 to join iNaturalist, so it's not really the right thing for younger than 13-year-olds, but also like there's so many other things that you can do with young kids to participate in community science. There's another great website called SciStarter. It has community science activities to volunteer for. I can also drop that in the chat as well, and it also is for all ages. I have especially been excited about seeing things for like Girl Scouts, brownies and daisies and Cub Scouts of all ages. So there's a lot of great examples there as well. And I'll put those things in the chat.
And Dena could probably answer this too. I think as far as like the Sentinel site network specific piece, the short answer is that we don't currently have like specific opportunities tied to our Sentinel sites, but that is very much something that we plan to incorporate going forward. So we've really, I don't know if I mentioned this during our talk, but the goal is long term. It took several years just to ramp this up and get everything installed. So last year was our first year of data collection. So we're really kind of at the beginning. So now that we've got our equipment out, we're able to kind of turn the corner and switch our focus now to the analysis, to utilizing the data, and then to bringing in as many people as possible. and creating those types of more opportunities for engagement with the public and student groups and people of all ages. So I would say stay tuned for that one. It is something that we intend to provide at some point, but we don't know what that will look like just yet. And Dena, feel free to add if I missed anything that you've been thinking about that perspective.
Oh, the only thing I would add, this isn't necessarily for middle school students, but for undergraduates, is the California Biodiversity Network includes, and the Sentinel site network includes the UC Natural Reserve System. So the UC, University of California system, has a bunch of incredible natural reserves. And so they are also tapping into being part of the Sentinel site network. And they are this great, obviously, educational resource that can bring students out and learning and studying using this system. So we're excited to set that up as well.
Thanks, Dena and Whitney. I have a question for Ben about other indicator species that are important to the Karuk tribe, besides the ones that you highlighted.
Yeah, I would say, I'm glad you asked that question, because the tribe thinks of everything more holistically, like it, like all species really play their part in, and they can all, you pick any species, you pick a bat that that eats bugs, and that could carry disease and stuff, so that it creates a buffer zone from us to get diseases and other animals to get diseases. So even though, see, the Karuk tribe came up with their climate adaptation plan, right? Everybody can look that up and check it out. There was 22 species that they came up with, but in actuality, every species, just like every human, in my opinion, is important to the whole tapestry of our planet and our world. So it's like the worldview is really, I could even go so far as to say, in my opinion, maybe I'm not speaking for the tribe right now, or anybody for that matter, because I have strange ideas sometimes, but even those species that are invasive species, non-native species, even they play a role in their own way to like, to say, the circle of life or whatever, or what have you, you know what I mean? So it's there, I just made it even more complex for everybody. I don't even know if I answered your question very good, but there you go.
I think the bottom line is we could take a peek into the Karuk adaptation plan and look at the indicator species that you discuss in that document.
Yeah, the Pacific salamander, they're just to name some, there's indicators, plant species that we have as indicator species, from huckleberries to black oak, to grasses and certain, especially those culturals, those species of plants that we use in our basket weaving, that bear grass and woodwardia ferns, and stuff like that.
Okay, well, I think there's a link to the adaptation plan in the chat earlier in the thread for folks to look at. We're at 3:29, so I want to close by thanking all of our panelists for your time and for sharing your knowledge with us. A special thank you to Whitney for helping put this webinar together. And with that, I would like to invite everyone to join us for webinar number 5, happening at the end of July. That next webinar will focus on oceans. So a bit of a link to Monique's talk as well. We are partnering with the California Ocean Protection Council and convening that webinar. So we will have an agenda up within the next couple of weeks. We will have a recording of today's webinar available as well within the next couple of weeks. With that, thanks everyone and have a good afternoon. Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.